Welcome to the Cypher Podcast, where we discuss everything sci, the esoteric, and our paranormal world. I'm your host, Brett Stewart, here with my trusty co-hosts, David and Emily. And in today's show, we're headed off planet to a distant light in the sky, the red planet of Mars. We're going to be looking at a particularly strange ground anomaly referred to as Olympus Mons. It's a really strange formation. Emily's going to go into the backstory and the history, and there's some pretty interesting features about it that we looked into with our remote viewing work. We pulled out some of the history of it, as well as how it was formed, and, well, a lot of other things as well. We also are going to have a really interesting After Hours episode for you right after the main episode. You can get access to it by registering to become a supporting member over on our website, which is cypher.com or remoteviewingpodcast.com. In that one, we'll be discussing the parallels of our remote viewing work with the Urantia book, Merkabahs, and even reincarnation, so you won't want to miss that one. So with that, Emily, maybe you can start us off by starting with our main show, looking at Olympus Mons. It's associated with a volcano of some sort, but maybe you can describe what you tasked us with and a bit of the backstory for the viewers.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So it's absolutely the case that the mainstream scientific narrative about this particular landform is that it's a giant volcano, and that's actually the impetus or the idea for having this task in the first place. I've been looking into this land formation because of its tie-in with this concept known as the electric universe or plasma cosmology, and it's basically an alternative set of scientific explanations for how things happen at the cosmological scale as an alternative to things like dark matter and that sort of thing. Olympus Mons is an example potentially of a property that we see in plasma, and I'll get into that in a minute. I just want to cover off the actual tasking. So I had Brett and David look into Olympus Mons on Mars. I gave coordinates, and then I asked them to describe the geological landform and that landform's creation process. That was the wording from the tasking. So as Brett mentioned before, it is quite large in terms of the area it covers. It's about the size of the state of Arizona, and for our European audience, it's roughly the size of Italy or Poland, the entire country. So it's quite a large structure. It's actually the largest mountain in our known solar system. There may be larger mountains on planets we can't see, but as far as we know, it's the largest. And that's roughly speaking 3 times the height of Mount Everest, depending on how you measure and where you measure, but roughly speaking 3 times taller than Mount Everest. The sides drop off very sharply, and they've been eroded and had some dust blown in over time. It's a pretty sharp drop off that's 6 kilometers or 4 miles high, which is quite the sight, I'm sure, if you're standing at the base of this thing looking up. And the mainstream science consensus around what this is that it's a shield volcano. Shield volcanoes are these very slow creating volcanoes where there's a little bit of lava trickling out over time, and they sort of build up this almost like this dome structure. Now, why do scientists think this? Well, it turns out that we, as our current human species, haven't landed a probe on Mars to collect soil samples in this area. We are not even planning to because of the fact that this thing is so tall, you can't actually land a spacecraft on it. There's no atmosphere. A lot of the spacecraft we send to Mars actually use things like the atmosphere and parachutes to brake as they're entering into the surface. It's so tall, it's actually kind of above the atmosphere. So there's no way to actually get on top of it using the conventional braking systems. And even if they could, it's so dusty and there's so much rubble and debris that the equipment probably wouldn't last very long. Scientists are very concerned about that, and also that they may not even get rock samples from these areas. So it's not even an area people are planning to go because of these properties. And you'll see in a moment why I'm mentioning that. But so basically all of the theories of why this is a volcano come from satellite imagery, and then geologists and planetary scientists take these satellite images and they go, okay, well, let's look at things on Earth and what can we match that up to? And of course they're like, oh, it's like this, the volcano. And then they go and they take a computer model and they say, well, can we build a computer model that will simulate what happens with lava to recreate something that looks like this structure? And if we can do that, we can say that plausibly this is a volcano. Now, to me, that seems like a bit of a stretch, right? So you've got First of all, their model and they start to look at evidence like this moat around the outside and even the craters on top, and they start to try and shoehorn in their volcano theory. The mountain at the top has a giant set of craters, and they're not like you'd think of when you think of a crater, like an impact crater that has a little bit of a like a concave or like an inverted dome shape. These craters are actually completely flat at the bottom. They do try and make analogies to, oh, this is like a caldera volcano. So this thing is the dome goes up and then it collapses to perfectly flat. But there's actually 6 perfectly flat craters that are kind of embedded with each other in an arrangement together, which some people think that's a little bit too much of a stretch to call that a volcano.
So when I took a look at this for the first time in photos, I actually didn't even realize this was on Mars. This seems to be not of the most interest to the wider internet. It's just, oh, it's just a mountain. There's nothing too strange about this. But then when you get down into some of these details, you're like, wait, what are you talking about? There are these miles high, wide, just sheer drop-off cliffs around an enormous mountain that goes up into the atmosphere. How is something like this even formed? And we don't have anything else like this anywhere else. So it was pretty strange looking. I remember the first time I saw it.
It's not the only strange thing about this formation as well, isn't it? There's like 3 other ones. And I'd heard of Olympus Mons and it being this huge giant thing. Then when you look at the satellite imagery, it's like, wow, this is much more interesting than I thought it was, because I'd heard the volcano story. Why would they lie, right?
Well, it's probably they're not trying to lie. They're just, this is their best guess. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that's worth mentioning. And I think we've touched on this as well in the reshot structure episode, where when geologists are looking at these formations, they have a set of tools in their tool bag, if you will. And these tools are, well, we look around on planet Earth, we have erosion, we have wind, we have volcanism. And with these things we observe in the present day on Earth, we try and explain how everything gets created. And I'm almost certain that there's no mainstream academic geologist. There are some now, and this is where the plasma universe theory comes in, the plasma cosmology electric universe theory comes in. They're saying, well, occasionally there can be these giant planet-sized bolts of lightning, for lack of a better word, these giant plasmas that can occur at a planetary scale, and they can actually explain these formations. In fact, they explain them better than anything else. But because we don't observe it in the present time on Earth, it's not in the geologist or the planetary scientist's tool bag. And so they're doing the best they can with the explanations they have in their disposal. So plasma has an interesting property in that the effects scale up. So basically, you can create a laboratory experiment on a desk to simulate certain functions of plasma, basically what the plasma can do to a material. And then you can scale that up. So if your plasma was 10 times the size or even 1,000,000 times the size, it would have similar effects on the materials that it's interacting with. So scientists have been able to recreate in a laboratory environment using an electric arc and a clay anode, almost the exact shape of Olympus Mons, with the various curvatures and the flat center and the sharp edges on the outside. So it's quite interesting that not only do we have an explanation, but actually some of our remote viewing data corroborates this particular explanation. And I think with that, why don't we get David? David, do you want to share with us what you found when you first looked at this?
So my data are consistent with the plasma theory. When I first looked at the detailed pictures in later that I'd never heard this plasma concept before, it kind of looks like a bad weld. It really does have a look that seems to be consistent with that to me. I mean, obviously, that's not proof. In my remote viewing data, I described it as a forceful process, forcing together, forging, crush, impact, energetic. I had AOLs of hammer and thunder, and it reminded me of the Lord of the Rings movies with Mount Doom and all of this just fire and noise and pressure. It was consistent with a volcano, but I've never been inside a giant plasma discharge, so I've got nothing to compare it to. It was certainly wild. I have remote viewed volcanoes before, and it was not like this, but perhaps it's just the scale of the thing that made it such an extreme experience there.
So, Brett, what was your first contact with the site like? What was your impression? I want to remind the listeners, by the way, that this was all blind. They had no idea what I'd tasked them with.
Yeah, so my data begins with a description of the site, which is, it's funny because we have this thing referred to as an AOL, or we think it might be an analytic overlay in our work. And I felt immediately like I was either on the moon or I was on Mars. And the reason why I felt I was in one of these environments was because it was really dusty, it was completely barren, and it was devoid of life everywhere. And it's like I could see there was something weird. The atmosphere itself felt really thin. And so that's why I lean towards, it's like, I feel like this is more Mars than the moon because I don't see dark, empty space, but I do see like a really thin atmosphere, and all of the dirt in the ground, and it felt sandy, was had a brownish kind of red hue to it. I didn't see it as red as you see in the pictures, but it definitely was a barren brown landscape. So once I established kind of a foothold there, I looked around, and what I perceived was my first impression, and this is just a first impression, is it felt like I was on the edge of a crater. And so there was an incredibly steep drop off down into a lower area. Where I was kind of on this crest of this really far cliff. And I think at two different points I was viewing it, because there's actually two different drop offs on Olympus Mons. There's the one on the outer ring of this formation. Instead of the mountain continuing that we normally would see in foothills down to a lower valley, it's like if someone just kind of chopped that off and it went straight down to the lower ground. There's that drop off. And then there's also up near the peak, instead of a mountain going up to a point, it goes up to a circle where that's what Emily referring to as these kind of flat formations pushed in. The first impression was that I was on like the rim or the edge of an impact crater of some kind. Later on in my work, I get more of the information about the formation. I see some similar things in my work that backs up, again, this idea of electrical energy and some other interesting things associated with it and why. But I felt like I was standing on Mars in the session on the edge of a huge crater before I then peered what was under this crater.
We did have this other idea, which I don't know whether it's supported by our data, but I think we should consider it as a possibility that if you had a volcano structure that was pre-existing and really tall, that could function like a lightning rod. If some big electrical phenomena is going to happen, then it's going to go to the highest point, right? Like I say, that's not necessarily supported by our data, but I think we should just consider that the answer could be both rather than one or the other.
So that's a good point, David. While I think that is definitely a possibility, another thing we have to factor in is, earlier David mentioned there's a few other structures like this on the surface of Mars, and it turns out there are actually three. There's three more mountains. They're not as big as Olympus Mons, but they are very large, and in fact, these three are all in a straight line, and the distances between them are roughly the same. And then if you took that line and drew sort of a 90-degree angle, like a tangent off of the center of that line, that tangent intersects the middle of Olympus Mons perfectly. And so if these started off as natural volcanoes that then acted as lightning rods, it would be pretty odd to see this as a natural pattern, considering that there's actually nothing else of this scale, as far as I know, on the surface of Mars. So it's not like Mars has this in 5 places. It's just in this particular pattern. Of course, there are potentially other things that look like volcanoes or craters on Mars, but they're at a whole different order of magnitude. They're way smaller than these very distinctive features. So I think we have to keep in mind that these things are in a very particular pattern, and I think we'll get into that later on with some of Brett's data.
And this is actually something in my work that I also perceived, is I felt like this wasn't alone, that there were other versions of this. In my data, I use the analogy, it's like these look like enormous satellite dishes that are buried in the ground. There's one, I believe, in South America where I've seen pictures of these. I forget what the name is. These massive satellite dishes that are made out of concrete that have a huge curvature for looking deep into space. And I was getting that analogy that that's kind of like what this is. Not that that's exactly what it is, but it's like this visually. It's like this impression in the ground that's massive. And I also got the impression that there are other versions of this in other more distant remote areas as well, which matched up with the feedback material afterwards.
So another thing to note about the plasma discharge, or the high energy plasma, not only does it have the ability to carve out and almost grind away at surfaces, it also has the effect of raising material up and actually depositing it in a particular shape. So it has, interestingly enough, the ability to both carve what appear to be more like craters or canyons while simultaneously deposit material and actually raise up mountains.
So it's interesting considering that this could happen on a planetary scale because people actually use this very effect as a machining process. It's called electrical discharge machining, I think, and you basically use plasma to drill through metals. They use it for drilling in delicate metals, and you can drill through like ball bearings and stuff that would just be too slippery and awkward. It's very accurate. It's really interesting to consider that, as you say, this stuff scales up, and this could be what happened on Mars.
That leads me into Brett's data, where Brett actually discovered something underneath this mountain, something that may have been the impetus for why the plasma discharge that we're theorizing actually struck these particular locations.
Yeah, so in my work, I first had the site data, which I already described. It felt like I was on Mars. I was describing a massive land formation, very dusty environment, sandy, dirt was everywhere, very barren, kind of dead, desolate. What I also got, though, was what this dirt and this land formation was covering. And what I described in my work was a massive megastructure, something that looked like a ziggurat or a South American pyramid that had been laid to waste. And so I had the analogy, it's like you take a building, smash it over on its side, and then put a whole bunch of dirt on top of it. And that's what we're looking at here. And so when I peeked my head down into it, and I was like, well, what's in this soot? I found that there were a lot of smaller structures which resembled a city to me. It resembled that this was a rather large city that had potentially at one time a lot of people living there. This is, however, the aftermath or the grave of something that used to exist that was completely and utterly destroyed. And it's interesting that you described that they can't land a rover here because it's too dusty or this isn't solid ground, because that's exactly what I was perceiving in my session. It's like there's this fine material that's covering everything, and things are like half buried or semi-buried, and it's like this soot that has landed on top of everything to cover it. But what it's covering feels artificial. It's a rather large structure.
So, Emily, does this dust get here by like electrostatic attraction then? Kind of like how cat hair sticks to everything? Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I think that's the closest analogy we could use to relate it to what the average person's familiar with. If you remember earlier, I mentioned there's this moat around the outside of the mountain. That's part of the material that gets deposited. It sort of carves out a moat and then elevates that material up in a particular way. And the material is actually at the mercy of the electricity. The electricity actually overcomes gravity and overcomes all sorts of other things. Plasmas are strange things. The temperatures are so intense that matter almost takes on a completely different form. In fact, plasma can actually vaporize rocks. You have solids going directly to vapors, and I think plasma is actually its own state of matter.
Something that was a little challenging in the remote viewing work, at least early on, to understand is that I had that structures that appear to be buried here under this very fine material, this like dusty environment, but it also extends deep, deep underground. So I was describing a vast underground catacomb or network of different structures. And I think in the after hours, we're going to go a little bit more in detail about what we found, both David and I found in these underground catacombs, which is really bizarre. But what happened in the remote viewing data is Emily was like, okay, how is this land formation created? But then it just so happens to be that there's a slightly more, a brighter light, if you will, of something going on deep under the ground of this area that we both got pulled to. I know I did in detail. And so we kind of need to go, well, hold on. What about the site? Describe the site. I'm like, okay, let me go back. Well, I mean, it's kind of boring. There's some dirt here. There's a formation. It's just something's been destroyed. And then there's been a lot of energetics that have kind of put dust and dirt over the top of everything. But there's definitely something very interesting deep underground here.
It's quite common that your attention will be drawn to something that's just much more interesting than the target. I worked a project once that was trying to detect art forgery, and all of the viewers were describing some incredible event that happened 2 years later in the same location because it was just much more interesting than pencil sketches. And I think that's what's happened to Brett and me here, is that we were meant to look at some geology. And the very first thing that came up in my session was life, quite a lot of life as well. And I think Emily sent me back 3 times going, can you look at the life forms was saying, well, it was kind of like that when we got here. So I had to go back to before the interesting events to look at the geological thing.
Yeah, I was expecting we're going to look at either volcanoes or lightning bolts. And then as we kept going back and retasking, very clear narrative started to emerge. And what was really fascinating was that both of your sessions corroborated each other in a way that I don't think we've seen yet on this podcast. There was so much overlap. It was, okay, they're onto something. And clearly this target isn't anything like what I expected it would be when I first assigned it to you. So up until now, we've been describing the site itself, what might be underneath the mountain, and some sort of a big energetic event that occurred. Brett, do you want to take us from there in your session and what you discovered after this energetic event, and maybe some of the backstory to what happened as it relates to the energetic event?
Yeah. So in my work, I was describing a structure that's hidden, and it's hidden by all this dust and debris and dirt. And I went back and I looked at what caused this to occur, what caused the structure to be hidden. And this is important to delineate between the deep catacomb tunnels, which we're going to talk about in After Hours. That's separate. That was kind of like a more numinous target, as opposed to what Emily was interested in specifically, which was the mountain itself. And so when I looked at the structure associated with the mountain that's being hidden by all the dust, I actually got an entire story narrative around an ancient group of people that were living there. And then where it ended was, well, it ended with everyone becoming deceased. So when I first looked at it, I had the structure and I was getting ideas of a story surrounding these was one of a great loss of life. And the history reminded me of the Trail of Tears, which is an event that occurred in the 1800s in the US under President Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy, where he forced the entire Cherokee Nation to give up its lands and migrate to present-day Oklahoma. And it's called the Trail of Tears for a reason, because thousands of men, women, and children died along the way to these new lands. It was really just a horrible, horrible thing that the US government did to the Native Americans.
Brett, I just want to point out, you're basically saying that there was a giant city where people lived on Mars. I mean, that in and of itself is like a huge revelation, coming from, are there lightning bolts creating a mountain, to whoa, we've got entire, not just civilizations, but people, and it's Mars, and it's a whole thing. So I please unpack that for us. There's a lot going on here.
Well, my remote viewing data says that there were multiple cities on Mars, and these particular cities to me appeared to look like mega structures. The surrounding environment was very desolate. It was void of life. And then there were these kind of last remaining outposts of society that have all these millions and millions of people stacked in really closely to one another in this enormous ziggurat is what it looked like. And I actually ended up running an ERV session on this, and I saw the entire event unfold, which ended with this massive lightning bolt from the sky coming down and hitting the city. And what occurred is, I believe that the actual lightning bolt itself was not an accident, that this was part of an experiment, but the end result is that it didn't really work. See, it was an experiment that went wrong, and the end result was pretty much everybody becoming deceased. What I saw in the ERV session, I was kind of looking at it from far away, and I saw this massive megastructure, and from the sky, a very, very bright line of like electricity comes from the sky down to the ground, right into the middle of where the city was. And it was thin and not that bright at first. And it was kind of, have you ever seen one of those Tesla coils where the kind of the electricity moves a little bit in place, but it stays stationary? It looked like that, and it was rather thin from a distance. It wasn't that big, but the more that the time went on, the bigger and bigger and bigger that this electrical line increased. And it got to a point where my impression in the ERV session is those who were creating this or causing this to happen, there's supposed to be a point where it just shut off. And it's like, okay, we're done now, but that never happened. What seemed to occur is that the experiment ran away from them, and it kept increasing in intensity and in size that it got to a point where it became so enormous and there's so much energy there that it emitted a shockwave that just immediately pulverized everything in the space. So anyone who was watching from a distance was instantly dustified. Even the city itself was dustified. In present time, I got the sense that there were still catacombs that exist there now, but the city, when this event happened, is, for all intents and purposes, gone. In my remote viewing work, I use the phrase, it's been removed from the world. It was splintered off in a fiery inferno that reminds me of hell.
Wow, that's quite a punchline.
So I didn't mention earlier, I wanted to not spoil the surprise, that my Mount Doom energetic, hammering, thundering event as in the creation process of the structure, I did feel it was artificial or deliberate in some way. I also described the use of a tool, or made the analogy of a tool that wanders off. You know, if you've ever tried to drill into a wall and you hit the edge of a brick and your drill bit goes in the mortar and the whole thing, you just make a huge mess and you've got to fix it before your wife sees. Like it's that. It's a tool that misbehaves, right? You're trying to go in a straight line and it just wants to wander off and go here and there. And I said it must be supervised. I mean, if there's one good thing for these guys who did this, at least there was nobody left alive to see how badly they screwed up, because they're never going to live that one down.
Now, Brett, would you say that this is something that occurred simultaneously at all four of these giant mountain-like structures, or did you get a sense that there were actually discrete events at all of the different sites?
I got the impression that this was all happening at the same time, that this was a coordinated event, that a certain group of people, particularly those who were involved in designing the experiment, those who were involved with what could be labeled as government or leadership officials of the society, they knew this was going to happen and it was set in stone as a planned event. The people who lived in these cities, though, did not know this was going to happen. I don't know if it was more of just for my own sake to understand it, but everyone else was standing there in just amazement going, what in the world is happening? There was a disparity on information about the event for those who was being directed at and those who were causing it. And I think this was happening simultaneously in multiple places at the same time. It's just that the outcome was not what those who created the event anticipated. And I think it actually affected them just as negatively as those that they were directing at.
Do you get a sense of why they wanted to do this in the first place? Like, I know that leadership and all sorts of really terrible people exist who will do bad things to their populations, but why in this case do you think that they were doing this? Did you have anything in your data that would explain that?
Yeah, I think there are two specific elements in the work that I perceived. The first element felt very religious. And I actually, in several places, felt like those who were there would call this holy ground. So there was a directive of some kind from an authority figure, whether it was something like government leadership or something like a priest class saying, and again, I think these are the people in the know of what was about to happen, that this was directed intentionally because from God on high said to do this. I don't know if that's true. It may be those just authority figures at the time were handing down a decree that this is what should happen. But there was a religious element to this. And we see that even today, that there are cults or groups out there that feel that to save their followers, that their followers need to perish. And this is not an uncommon theme even here down on Earth. This has happened historically. But as far as why would they feel the need to do this? Well, when you look around, when I looked around at the site, I mean, you just look around at Mars today, similar things were there where this is a completely barren landscape. These megastructures were not built for the fun of it. But I got the impression of these megastructures, these large cities were built because these were like the last bastions of the society on the planet, is that the resources, the environment itself was so destroyed that the only way that the society could survive was to band together into these massive locations and live there and put all the resources into one point. You couldn't actually live outside these megastructures because there was no life. It was just barren. And so it was our time's just about up. We may as well go in a bang, and appears to be a religious one.
It really puts things into perspective, I think, in our current day and age where there's all this talk of going back to Mars and terraforming Mars and all this. and then contrasting that against the society that was super advanced and seemed to have all sorts of fancy technologies. And even they were just at this point where they felt hopeless about Mars, and the whole thing's kind of ruined, and they're living in these little bubbles. It seems like maybe our efforts here in this time might be a bit foolish, but that's maybe for another show.
Yeah, this topic echoes everywhere we look, doesn't it? We'll get into that more later on, but when we're now going back to Mars, are we going backwards to go forwards, or is that actually a regressive impulse that's driving humanity back to that place? I also got some data about this contrast between those who are enacting this terrible event and the everyday people. So overpopulation was a concept that came up, like overgrown, like a forest that's grown so dense that it's choked itself. You know, that it was a natural kind of thing. It had just, like a positive feedback loop, it had over-consumed and kind of burned itself out. But then looking at the people who are doing the terrible destructive act and everybody else, the ones who seem to be in charge of this, I wrote, nobody's laughing. This is somber, serious. There's only one path forward, and this is it. They feel like they have no choice. This is like a really big, significant deal. But then at the same time, I just asked myself, what's happening with everyone else? And I said, people, nice, good, happy, chill, they're just having a nice life. Whatever system they've got going seems to be working great. They're having a good time, they're living good lives. And at the same time, there's this priest class, perhaps they're going, oh, we're doomed, we need to bring in the space lasers to cleanse. I mean, it's just crazy, isn't it? Going back to that idea about killing and destroying in order to create. I'm sure we'll cover this in a future episode, but this is like an inversion or a perversion of actually like a positive impulse, isn't it? That is kind of turned on its head to become this ridiculous suicidal thing that's just a perversion of something which doesn't involve mass death and destruction. But that's a whole other topic.
So this task was definitely full of surprises for me as the tasker. First of all, I was surprised. I had a feeling there was civilizations associated with Mars. Ironically enough, I was trying to choose a target to do on Mars that wasn't associated with what people thought were a civilization. I was trying to pick a geological landform, and all of this data started pouring out at us. And there's certainly a lot of overlap between both David's sessions and Brett's sessions, but one of the things that really jumped out to me was what lies beneath this area deep, deep down. And it's striking to me how similar both David and Brett's sessions were with this stuff and how much they gravitated towards it. It seemed like this was the most important thing, which to me seemed very odd. I kept pushing them back to, no, look at the biggest mountain in the solar system. And they're like, no, there's this thing down beneath it. And it was an interesting dynamic for sure.
Yeah, the downward motion was one of the very first things that came out in my session work, like a down, heavy, down, dangling, going, dropping. And I know, Brett, the front page of your session, there's a tall thing and there's down. It's like we both just couldn't get away from that.
Right. So both of you had this pulling down deep into the underground. That's where your attention was drawn. Brett, do you want to give us a little sneak peek at what you found deep down?
It's interesting because there's some parallels, which we're going to talk about in the after hours, between our remote viewing work and other remote viewing work that other parties have done, as well as other more esoteric written material that talks about Mars and civilization on Mars that seems to rhyme with what we found underground. And what's down there, I believe, is still there to this day. And it's a type of technology that is associated with the spirit. It's associated with spiritual beings. And I think this is a reason why we got so much data that had to do with religion, is I believe there was a religious group surrounding this, almost like what you'd find in Egypt, where I believe the priests in Egypt, they had a lot more information perhaps available to them, but the majority of the common man was completely clueless as to what the Egyptian priests, the knowledge, the secret groups and the cults that existed there. It was a very similar dichotomy. And I think we're also going to talk in the after hours about some of these parallels, even with Egypt, that even we were surprised in some of our research. So what's underground? Our work seems to describe something associated with life after death. And there may have been a reason for why this secret society would have committed genocide against their own people, because they thought there was something that they could lead to afterwards.
So we've got a little bit dark here with this destruction and genocide and strange things going on after death and these evil priests. But in my session, as well as all this dark stuff, I also got the creation of new life. So I'm really looking forward to going into how that fits into the bigger picture and who those people were.
Yeah, and I think we're going to do that in the After Hours episode. So if you'd like to join us on that, please do. We're going to have an awesome discussion going into these more esoteric and the woo field. You can do that by heading over to cypher.com or remoteviewingpodcast.com. You can register, become a member, and get access to the private shows where we go a little bit into more the paranormal and the strange. So we're gonna take that journey next. Please join us. If not, though, we definitely thank you for joining us on this exploration of Olympus Mons. It was a really interesting, I think, phenomenon that appeared like a natural formation, but our work seems to suggest there's a little bit more than meets the eye. And I think if you look a little bit more critically at the actual formation itself, there's a big question mark, and it doesn't quite fit with the models that just resulted in the formation. So we hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. Don't miss it. We'll see you then. Take care, everybody.